The book of Leviticus is a weird book for most people. It can be a long and kind of boring read full of weird rules and rituals for the children of Israel to follow. But I'd like to propose that Leviticus, the whole book, is actually a lot deeper. It's a lot more important and so much more interesting than just being a book of just odd rules and regulations. I'd also like to show you how this week's Torah portion, which is chapters 16 through 18, is the heart of Leviticus. So to fully understand Leviticus, we need to understand the setting. We need to understand where we're at. And so thus far in the biblical narrative, we have the people of Israel who are coming out of Egypt in this grand exodus. They're led by Moses to Mount Sinai, where God speaks the Ten Commandments and enters into a covenant relationship with Israel. So he has these plans to make them prosper, to set them apart among the nations, and to have his spirit dwell with the people in a tabernacle. However, shortly after they enter into the covenant, Israel commits a horrible sin with the golden calf, breaking that covenant and making the people unholy and preventing them from entering into the tabernacle. In fact, at the end of Exodus, it actually says that not even Moses was able to enter the tabernacle. And that's where you start to see the importance of the book of Leviticus. You look at Leviticus 1:1, where it starts. It says that we're reminded of Moses' inability to enter the Torah or enter the tabernacle by saying, the Lord spoke to Moses from the tent. Moses was outside the tent, and the Lord was speaking to Moses from the tent. Something changes. Something happens between the beginning of Leviticus, end of Exodus, to the beginning of Numbers. Because in Numbers 1:1, you see that it says in the beginning that the Lord spoke to Moses in the tent. So we have this transition where Moses and the Israelites are forced outside of the tent, and then after the book of Leviticus, he's now inside the tent. And that's where you start to see the importance of Leviticus and what it's truly about. It's about how God has created a way graciously for a sinful people to be reconciled back into his presence. And so something that's really cool about Leviticus is how it's structured, how the whole book is structured. It's structured in this very symmetrical way. You've got three categories, three kind of ways that God has laid out for his people to be reconciled back with him. You have chapters 1 through 7 and 23 through 25, which are the rituals and holy days. These are the different sacrifices that the Israelites offer to either say thanks or to give thanks or to ask for forgiveness when they've sinned. And then the second section is that it goes over the holy days, the Day of Atonement, not the Day of Atonement, the Feast of Tabernacles, First Fruits, etc. The next section, the next category, has to do with the priests. So we have chapters 8 through 10, which goes over the ordination and inauguration of Aaron and his sons as priests. But we also see the death of Aaron's two sons, which serves as an example. They die as a result of presenting unauthorized fire before the Lord. And so it serves as an example, and it shows that the priests must remain holy and pure before God. Then in chapters 21, 22, we see what qualifies someone as priests. So that's the second section. Then we have the third category, the third parallel, which goes over the purity of the Israelites and how to remain pure, how to remain clean. And so we have chapters 11 through 15, which are a lot of rituals and laws. It's being ritually pure, physically pure. We see this is where we get the eating clean laws. This is the laws about not touching dead bodies, as well as what to do with certain diseases and bodily fluids. And so it has to do with being pure, clean in a physical sense, so that we can prevent a physical death, but also prevent those things that symbolize death from entering into God's presence. Then in chapters 18 through 20, we talk about the laws of holiness or the moral standards and behaviors that Israel's supposed to uphold to separate them from the other nations. How they're supposed to treat each other, their sexual relationships, as well as the spiritual practices and pagan practices that either keep us closer to or farther away from God's presence. So we have those three main categories, which are basically solutions or tools that God has provided for us to either stay in his presence or to return back into his presence. But there's one section that I haven't talked about yet, And that's this middle section, the heart of Leviticus, as I called it earlier. And this is chapters 16 and 17. And it's the biggest part of this week's Torah portion. This is where we have one more way that God gives us to come back into his presence. And that is the Day of Atonement. The Day of Atonement, here all of the sins of Israel that couldn't be covered by the rituals, the sacrifices, the priestly work, this is where they are covered. And this is where it's discussed and accounted for. During this ritual, this annual ritual, one goat, there are two goats, and one is slaughtered to atone for the sins of the people. The blood is then taken and poured out on the altar before God. The other goat has all of the sins confessed over it by the high priest, symbolically placing the sins of the people onto that one goat. And that's where it is then driven out into the wilderness so that the sins are completely removed from the people. The most important solution to our sin problem, where we see blood spilled out before God to atone for our sins. It says in chapter 17 that the life is in the blood, which shows the meaning, the reasoning for a need for the sacrificial system. It shows that the blood of the slain is in place of our blood. You know, the life, that there needs to be a life that's in place of ours. Which is why when you look, fast forward, and you see Jesus during the Last Supper when he says, this is my blood that is shed for many for the forgiveness of sins. It's so much bigger than just a surface reading could show. The life is in the blood, and it doesn't belong to me. It's Jesus' blood that was spilled before God, just like the goat that was sacrificed on the Day of Atonement, except Jesus serves the purpose of both of those animals. He's both the goat that has all of our sins confessed on him. He both bears our sins and then is slaughtered before God on the cross, where his blood is shed to completely remove and eradicate all of our sins. I think Hebrews 10 sums it up pretty well. Hebrews 10, 1 through 4, since the law has only a shadow of the good things to come, it is not the actual form of those realities. It can never perfect the worshipers by the same sacrifices they continually offer, year after year. Otherwise, wouldn't they have stopped being offered, since the worshipers, once purified, would no longer have the consciousness of sin? But in the sacrifices, there's a reminder of sins every year. For it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. It is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. It's the blood of King Jesus, Yeshua Messiah, that our sins are fully taken away. And that is what the Day of Atonement, that is what Leviticus points towards. Leviticus is the shadow of things to come, of God's plan to reconcile a sinful people back into his presence. In the heart of it, the Day of Atonement, the day our Messiah was sacrificed. Shalom.